There's a developing story in Canada that's very interesting, a little technical. So we're going to get into that with our next interviewee, Dr. Ramanan Krishnamurti, who's the Chief Energy Officer at the University of Houston. So welcome to the interview, Ramanan.
Thanks so much, Markham. Appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
I want to give you the context because this is a little bit convoluted. Under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, carbon credits are available to be transferred from one country to another if the receiving country provides assistance of some kind. Maybe it could be financing, renewable energy technology, but something that lowers emissions, and carbon credits are created, then they can be transferred. Have I got that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. In fact, that the idea that you can get carbon credits one of two ways, right? So either you can reduce, or you can eliminate. So you can essentially go to a green energy source.
Now here's where it gets interesting. The Alberta government has asked the Canadian government to negotiate agreements with other countries so that a thing called avoided emissions would qualify for those credits. And it specifically, this story revolves around liquefied natural gas, LNG. Because natural gas has half the GHGs of coal, the argument goes that if Canada ships LNG to Asia, where it would displace coal in a power plant, then carbon credits should be created and they should come to Canada. So the more LNG you send, the more coal you displace, the more carbon credits you get back, and that would then take emissions off Canada's national inventory. Now, that's fairly controversial. We'll get to that in a moment. But Ramanan, I've seen arguments that is avoided emissions are specifically excluded under Article 6. Is that the case?
No, they're not. And in fact, you can have either replacement or reduction, both qualify for carbon credits. And these are
okay.
Yeah. And this,
so if I understand this correctly,
Article 6, it's also a way of being traded right now between private entities, right? So even going one step beyond national sort of bartering of carbon credits, it is now starting to become a real value, commercially exchangeable value.
Okay. Under Article 6, let me back up. If the LNG is sold at full commercial rates to the customer, let's say Japan, even if the LNG does displace coal, it's Japan that gets the emissions credit, the carbon credits. Am I correct?
That's correct.
What would be the incentive for Japan to transfer those credits to Canada? Because they paid full freight for the product.
Well, if Canada is willing to pay or give them a discounted value for the LNG to get those carbon credits, then absolutely they're going to do it, because everybody is on a race to try and find ways to meet their expected national goals. And everybody is trying to find the least painful way to get there, because mitigating carbon emissions means that we have to change the way we do business. It is likely to cost money. It is likely to create systems that are perhaps not as mature, perhaps less reliable, less resilient, and therefore more risky. So in order to take that and trade off that risk, you want to get paid for it.
Now, the argument goes that there are methane emissions reduction regulations that are being put in place in Alberta and British Columbia, so that to basically decarbonize the natural gas production. Then the LNG, the liquefaction plants, will be electrified to keep emissions there at a minimum. And the two of those together would create clean LNG. So then that would provide the difference. But aside from giving, say, Japan a discount on the price of a load of LNG, are there any other incentives that Canada could offer to somehow have those credits transferred to Canada?
Well, the easiest way is the economical equation. There could be other ways of doing this too. For instance, if I'm looking at Japan creating more sort of negative emissions technologies in the space that they would have had to take up for a coal-fired power plant, that could also be a big source of carbon credits that they could then be able to transfer. So there are multiple ways in which this could get played out, but most likely, most business folks will tell you they're going to take the simplest route to get there rather than the most complicated route to get there.
And that means a reduction in price. The price has to reflect the carbon.
It has to be discounted. It has to be discounted in some form. Yes.
Right. And my understanding is that if this transaction is to take place, there has to be an agreement between the two countries. So Canada would have to have an agreement with Japan or China or Vietnam or whoever it wanted to trade LNG for the carbon credits. Is that the case?
They have to, yes. Indeed, yes. There would have to be an agreement. That would be the only way to do it.
Are we seeing other LNG exporting countries like Australia, the United States, Qatar, any of the other Middle Eastern countries that export LNG? Are we seeing them consider the same kind of strategy?
Right now, the focal point with LNG, because of availability, has been to really get the cheapest LNG to locations of interest. Over the last year, with all the sort of convolutions that have happened to the LNG market, we've started to see some, prior to Ukraine, we saw some very interesting things happen. For instance, the first net zero LNG tanker got shipped from the United States out to I think India, where it was a net zero one because there were carbon offsets that were provided for by other mechanisms for that natural gas. That got a premium. That natural gas actually got a premium because essentially that was natural gas that India could import and have no carbon, effectively no carbon emissions associated with it. That was seen as a big step forward. Over the last year or so, many of these things got put on hold because of Ukraine. Now that we've seen natural gas prices come back to earth, there's a real market where we're now starting to see somewhat of a glut in the LNG market. We're starting to see this sort of interesting ways. And the second part of this is many of the countries have not reached or are not on track to get to their 2030 goals. So they're starting to come back and say, how do I start to approach this? How do I start to deliver this? Because their societies are saying, listen, you promised that you would put us on a path to reduce the carbon intensity of our society. We trusted you to do it. You've not shown us progress. And so the governments in those countries are starting to get more creative at this.
Now, Ramanan, when I look at the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook 2022 and BP's energy statistics from last year, they show three scenarios, and in every scenario, the most conservative scenario, the most status quo scenario, shows LNG use basically peaking in 2023 and almost flat, just a little bit of a rise out to 2050. The other two scenarios show a very sharp drop-off in demand. So the assumption is that by 2030, it's more or less, it's likely perhaps that LNG peaks and then begins to decline. But in the scenario we're talking about, where governments are now, or countries are importing LNG to displace coal and getting off coal as quickly as possible, can you foresee a scenario in which LNG exports and trade actually continues to rise to 2050 and beyond.
In fact, I would say almost every scenario that I look at today, and if I start to look at the large demand centers, natural gas is going to continue to be the hottest commodity being traded around globally. I think there is very likely that there will be a significant growth in LNG, should we have the ability to deliver. And that's really the question is, do we have the infrastructure ready to deliver that LNG worldwide? Just give you an example. India, today, 6% of its energy comes from natural gas. They want to get to about 15% of their total primary energy coming from natural gas. That's in the next decade or so. They're also looking to increase their primary energy needs by a factor of 2. So effectively, it's taking 6% of their total energy needs today for 1.4 billion people and converting it to 15%, doubling their primary energy. That gets to 30% of the primary energy needs of India today would be met by natural gas. We're looking at a scenario, and this is sort of replicated across the variety of developing countries around the world. China, but for the hiccup right now in terms of the infrastructure, I think you're going to see natural gas grow and grow significantly.
So, assuming that scenario, Ramanan, it would seem that those countries that are reducing their fugitive methane emissions as quickly as possible, but by regulation and industry cooperation, and then electrifying the liquefaction process to take emissions out there, so that it would have, we'll call it a true net zero or clean LNG. Would a country like that, Canada perhaps, have a competitive advantage in the international marketplace?
I believe absolutely. In the sense that the cleaner you make your natural gas stream, the more you can demonstrate that the carbon intensity associated with that LNG is, in terms of fugitive components of it, are close to zero. You've got a great opportunity to really trade that as a valuable commodity. In fact, in that case, you might not have a discounted price. You might be able to actually get pretty close to market value because of the fact that you get this offsetting of the premiums for net zero LNG versus the cost of trading the carbon credits.
Right. So you might get a premium price, but if you take the carbon credits as well, then that price would be discounted to the market price.
Yep.
Gotcha.
There's one hiccup here. I think you identified fugitive methane sort of leaks. That the fact that you need to get to electrification being a big part of it. The sort of the thing that nobody is talking about is the amount of methane slippage that happens during shipping. That is a poorly accounted detail in the whole LNG value stream. That countries and shippers who can get ahead of the curve with that conversation are likely to see the biggest benefits.
Ramanan, really appreciate your insights here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.